Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a little bit of a chat and reaction to Time's 100 Best Fantasy Books of All Time list. I'm not going to go through every single book on this list, but if you are interested in seeing which books are on the list, I will have it linked down below. The first thing, and I think most of us are going to notice this when we look at this list, is the fact that they have multiple books from the same series listed for some series and then not other series. It's very strange to me. So they have all three of the Lord of the Rings books as separate books. And then they have, I think, one Harry Potter book, and then they have both of Tomi Adeyemi's books, and then they have one Mistborn book, and they have one Wheel of Time book. And I'm not gonna comment on whether I think a book deserves to be on this list. That's so subjective. But I do think it's strange that they would do that. They could have included more books on this list had they combined works together from the same series. Beyond that, I find it a bit peculiar how they decided this list, and so there's a little tiny tab at the top about how we chose the 100 best fantasy books of all time. And they let you know that they invited some well-known fantasy authors to help the Time staff decide these books. And those people, it shouldn't be a surprise because many of the people that they brought on have multiple books on the list. And they very specifically state that the authors could not nominate their own works. But two things here. I don't think it says that the authors can't nominate each other's works. And I don't think that the Time staff could refrain from, obviously, right? Because they're the ones who are deciding. So how awkward would it have been to invite George R.R. Martin on to the panel and not nominated A Song of Ice and Fire, at least one of the books in that series? Or how weird would it have been to be like, hey, Tomi Adeyemi, come be a panelist. We don't think your book deserves to be here, but you can come let us know your thoughts. They're, of course, going to nominate the people's books that they're inviting on to this panel. So already you're gonna have some bias bleed through, which it obviously does, because, and I know that I'm incredibly biased here, but the fact that they have one Mistborn book, Sanderson is known for having written so many works. Stormlight Archive, most people think that Stormlight Archive is the better Sanderson series, right? And not all of these books are completed series. Tomi Adeyemi's is not completed, so that's not the reason. But it's weird that an author who has so many works out and who I personally think, I mean, obviously, again, I'm super biased, but this particular author has a lot of influence on the genre, I think, even if you don't like him. So, for example, I've never picked up a Stephen King book. But Stephen King, there is a lack of King on this list. Joe Abercrombie is kind of the guy for grimdark right now, and grimdark is huge in fantasy, and there's an extreme lack of grimdark on this list. So anyway, I'm getting sidetracked a little bit. I mean, it's obvious that they had some bias when they were bringing these authors on. I mean, part of me just, I'm sorry, I'm trying to stay calm here because in the grand scheme of life, not that big of a deal. But they should have just had a list of these popular authors must-read fantasy books. Just have those authors come on and tell you their favorite fantasy books. Looking at this list, you can kind of already tell who probably nominated what. I could be wrong. I don't exactly think George R.R. Martin was nominating Six of Crows, but you know, who knows? I don't know who nominated or voted for what. But I would have preferred if they had just not asked any fantasy authors to be panelists. I think that's a really weird decision to make because, as the list shows, they clearly had bias. They couldn't have these authors come on and then not nominate their works. And they respect them. It's the reason they brought them on. I'm just going to end up talking in circles about that point. I've already made it. I think it's a little strange, and they're gonna obviously have favoritism towards those authors. But beyond that, the things that they were considering when they were nominating books. It says key factors including originality, ambition, artistry, critical and popular reception, and influence on the fantasy genre and literature more broadly. These factors are letting you know, okay, this is why these books are on this list. And I know there are a lot of people who are going to see certain books and think, oh, how could that be on the list, but not this, of course, right? And what is funny to me is some of the books that I would expect to be on this list based off of those factors are not here. And I know this might sound crazy, but if we're going to talk about influence on the fantasy genre, where is Twilight? I'm not saying Twilight should be listed, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be. But based off of these factors, if you have a Cassandra Clare book on there, I'm just kind of like, okay, but Twilight was all the rage, and it was vampires everything for a while. And the same goes now for Sarah J. Maas and Holly Black for Fae. That stuff is everywhere. I don't know if they would consider Hunger Games fantasy. It's kind of hard to tell what they consider fantasy based on this list, which is another thing that I'm like, is that I guess that's fantasy. There are some books that have had huge influence on the fantasy genre, and they're not here. And a little bit in my head, I thought, okay, well, maybe that's because they're trying to look at influence without popularity necessarily, but something doesn't have to be popular to be influential. So, for example, while I haven't read Chronicles of the Black Company, from what I understand, that has had a huge influence on a lot of modern fantasy authors, especially modern grimdark fantasy authors, and I don't think that's there. As far as ambition and creativity and artistry, V.E. Schwab is one of the most creative. I mean, so many people say whether they like her works or not, she has really incredible ideas. And so again, there's the ambition, there's the artistry, and I'm gonna be biased, right? I like her works. But Stephen King, I mentioned him a little bit before. I've never read a Stephen King book because, one, I'm a pansy. I get scared easily. And there's a lot of content in his books that I'm like, I'm so innocent though. I still feel like King has clearly had an influence on the genre. And the last point that I kind of want to make here is the most controversial, but they have a couple of translated works on this list. And I just feel like this list is kind of reinforcing this idea that to have a lot of influence on fantasy, you have to be American or someone from the UK, because that's where the publishing industry dominates. But there are authors around the world who are writing works that are extremely influential and have a huge impact on the genre, just not necessarily maybe in the American publishing industry or the UK publishing industry, but somebody like, well, actually, he does have influence now, and again, I'm biased, you know probably what I'm going to say, but Andrei Sapkowski with the Witcher series. At first I was like, okay, well maybe they're specifically talking about English written books. But no, they're not, because there are some translated books on this list, but only a couple. And I appreciate that they made an effort to have diversity on this list, because, you know, sometimes the best of lists, you might as well copy and paste the same thing over and over again, because you see the same people over and over again. And this one, you saw some variety, which I think is great, because they're acknowledging that there are different things about fantasy that are appealing to different people, and there are so many amazing, wonderful cultures that have influenced fantasy. I think they're showing that in this list, except it feels like only really if those works come from American writers or UK writers. And, you know, someone like Andrei Sapkowski is just one example. I'm not saying I'm the best ever at reading translated works. It's something I need to work on myself. There are definitely a lot of authors in other countries who have written books that have impacted thousands, if not millions of lives, and we're like, well, we don't really sell you here, though. Beyond just Andrei Sapkowski, another example would be an author, I haven't picked up their works yet, but if you look up this particular author of Upon a Burning Throne, they are an Indian author who has worked to take a lot of mythology and turn it into modern stories. From what I understand, they are an extremely successful author in India, and I feel like this is a perfect example of, I'm not saying this should have been on the list, but an example of where are the fantasy authors from other places? I hate being negative. I hate being entitled, which I feel like I'm absolutely being by being nitpicky about this list. I, again, am so appreciative that Time took the time to acknowledge the fantasy genre and to try to shed light on a lot of really amazing works. I think that's incredible. There are definitely some books on that list that I've never even heard of, and so that opens my eyes a little bit. I'm being extremely picky These are obviously just my opinions. I am very curious though, all of your opinions about this list. Are you somebody who feels more positively about it, that you think that they did a great job? Of course, everybody's not going to agree, but ultimately you just really respect the effort that they made. I know for a fact nobody's ever going to be 100% pleased with this list. I would never expect them to have exactly what I want on there. I more of just am surprised at some of the decisions. I don't really understand why we have like a couple of translated works and then the rest of the 100 are English speaking and writing authors, and how I guess I've already said my feelings on it. I really appreciate that Time made this list. I really appreciate the authors who were on the panel taking the time to do this and to try to represent fantasy the way they feel it should be represented. I am appreciative. I just don't necessarily... I think in the future they could go about making this list maybe a little differently. Let me know your thoughts on this list though. Who do you think should have been there that wasn't there? What are some things about this list that you really loved, didn't really love? But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.